Has anyone ever asked you, where are you from?
I'm from New York.
New York.
Houston, Texas.
LA.
Syria. Canada.
And then when you tell them where you grew up, they lean in and ask you, where are you really from?
America for a long time, but Polish before that.
Morocco.
German and some Poland.
And Ethiopia.
Scotland.
Persia.
Iran.
Tunisia.
I get asked this question a lot. I know some of you are wondering why a guy that looks like me is telling the Jewish story. Well, let me set the record straight. I'm definitely Jewish. So is she, so is he, so are they. Yet, we all come from the same place. Go far enough back and all Jews have the same answer to the question. But where are you really from?
When I was growing up in San Diego, no one ever thought I was Jewish. That's when I learned that to be perceived as Jewish, you needed to look white.
Here's another fun fact, I am Jewish.
You needed a last name like Rosenbaum or Goldstein. You needed grandparents who said, "Oy vey." And you probably looked like someone who couldn't run a mile without their asthma inhaler. So whenever I outed myself as a Jew, there were always a few people who did a double take.
No way.
It's impossible.
I wasn't white. I played varsity football. No inhaler required. And while some of my grandparents did speak Yiddish, they were just as likely to use Hebrew, Arabic, or Creole when they talked to one another. And that's not just because the stereotypes I've just described are one-dimensional and ridiculous, though they are. It's also because these stereotypes rest on a very narrow and recent view of Jews, totally ignoring most of our history. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, according to Jewish tradition, roughly 4,000 years ago, a man named Abraham began doing something odd. He began to worship one God and one God only. His descendants kept up with this strange practice. Eventually, those descendants grew into an entire nation of people worshiping the same God. And eventually, they carved out a distinct identity and set of practices. That's the basic story. Each of us has a family story that fits into the wider narrative of our people. Today, I'm going to tell you mine, moving backwards through time. We'll climb down the branches of my family tree until we get to the roots. Because as the product of 5 different diaspora communities, I know how complicated it can be to answer the question, where are Jews really from? But the further back we rewind, the clearer the answer becomes. So let's start our journey down the family tree. When I tell people that my mom's from Guyana, they usually react in one of 3 ways. First, they'll look at me and say,
"Where's that?"
Or if they're good at geography and they want to show off a little, they'll ask which one. For the record, it's this one. But all that is just a prelude to the most common reaction, which is, I had no idea there were Jews in Guyana. Surprise! There was a time when the Caribbean was home to a thriving Jewish community.
This is the Tzedek V'Shalom Synagogue. This is a Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Suriname.
This is Nachliel. He took me on a tour of my family history through the artifacts of Jerusalem's Israel Museum. And you heard him right. This is a synagogue from Suriname that was disassembled, shipped to Israel, and reassembled right here in Jerusalem.
So everything you see in white was basically shrunken down to scale so it can fit into the museum. But all the artifacts are original. Some are older, some are later. And this tzedakah box from 300 years ago tells you a lot. So it reads Pidyon Shivuim, which means rescuing captives, which is unfortunately a very contemporary issue. Yeah. But imagine a world in which Jews were captured and ransomed on a regular basis. Right. And this is what they're collecting money for.
My ancestors might have gone to services in the synagogue, or maybe a nearby synagogue called Dachei Yesharim, a synagogue founded by Jews of color. Caribbean Jews, like all Jews, survived because, while remaining uniquely Jewish, they also adapted to and integrated with the cultures around them through marriage and conversion. That's why many Ashkenazi Jews look European, and why many Iranian Jews look Iranian, and why many Caribbean Jews look like, well, me. So what brought Jews to the Caribbean? Was it the pristine beaches? The rum? The dance hall beats? Yeah, I wish. It was something a lot less fun. The Spanish Inquisition. Jews lived in the Iberian Peninsula since at least the 1st century CE, and possibly before. By the 14th century, they were thriving, producing some of the Jewish world's greatest scholarship, literature, and art. But things took a dark turn. In 1492, the King and Queen of Spain gave all the Jews in their territory a choice: death, expulsion, or conversion. Though conversion didn't help much when the church suspected you were secretly practicing Judaism and sent the Inquisition authorities after you. I got a small glimpse into the Inquisition when I visited with the head of the archives at Israel's National Library.
This is a ledger that was run by the administration of the Inquisition in Portugal, in Lisbon, and that's documenting the different auto de fe that were conducted in Lisbon. How many people were executed, who was the priest to give the sermon at the time.
This document represents a theme throughout Jewish history. Whether Jews clung to their faith or tried to assimilate, time and again they were seen as outsiders, foreigners who didn't belong. But if Iberian Jews weren't from Spain and Portugal, where were they from? And how did they get to Spain in the first place? Meet everyone's favorite old-school colonizers, the empire that's always on our minds. That's right, all hail the power of the Roman Empire. The mighty Roman Empire rolled into Judea in 63 BCE and refused to leave for 6 centuries. Even today, the land is littered with the artifacts and architecture they left behind, as well as the name they gave the region, Palestine. At first, the Jews of Judea had a fairly warm relationship with their Roman overlords, but the honeymoon period didn't last. The struggle got ugly fast. Welcome to the Great Jewish Revolt. A group of Jewish revolutionaries wiped out an entire Roman garrison, and then a second one. It didn't look good for the Romans. If they didn't put down the Jewish rebellion now, other colonies might start getting ideas.
So these coins are Jewish coins which were restruck on Roman coins and used for the temple service in the Great Revolt. This is a coin that says on one side, Shekel Yisrael, shekel of Israel, and there's the letters that represent the date. So this says Shin Hei, which means year 5, which is very rare because the rebellion was suppressed shortly after year 5. And on the other one, it says Yerushalayim HaKdosha, Holy Jerusalem.
These coins would have been made just months or even weeks before the rebellion was crushed in 70 CE. The Roman Empire won. They burned the temple to the ground, destroyed entire cities, and an estimated 1/3 of the population was dead. While many survivors stayed, others decided to relocate to greener pastures across the empire, including to the Iberian Peninsula. Hence, my mom's story. But that's only half the tale, because there's a whole other side of my family tree, and their story has just as many twists and turns. My dad's maternal grandparents were among the founders of the first religious kibbutz in 1937.
זו סבתא שלי.
אסתר מלר.
סבתא שלי.
מישהו כינה אותה הילדה הכי יפה בתל צבי. הנה, סימנתי אותה עם כובע על הראש. זה הדגם. אז זה מה שהם מצאו כשהם באו. חצר מרובעת עם חומה מסביב, 2 שערים, כמה חושות, הם הוסיפו אוהלים, 2 צריפים, וזה חומה ומגדל. זאת אומרת, באים ביום אחד, בונים חומה בסגנון שמה שבנו על הטירה. יבש מאוד, חם מאוד ואין צל.
Personally, it sounds pretty rough to me. I can't imagine what was going through my great-grandparents' heads when they showed up to this, having come from Germany. But I guess anything was probably better than staying in 1930s Germany. The Holocaust was the climax of a long, complicated, and painful history for Jews in Germany.
We know in the medieval period that sometimes it was only a very small amount of Jews that were allowed in a certain town. I mean, only 17 families here, 19 families there. They had to get a special charter that enabled them to actually live there.
Seems like a very precarious position to be, where it's like, okay, yeah, you've been granted these rights, even if it's not equal rights, at least the right to be tolerated in a certain city or village, but you're already getting ready for almost the eventuality that that's going to be rescinded, and how you're going to respond to that.
Yeah, so Jews were always, the wandering Jew, even if he was not wandering, was always waiting with a small suitcase somewhere.
Wow. Because again, like in Spain, even after 1,500 years in Germany, the Jews were still considered foreigners. And while Jews came to Germany over the centuries fleeing persecution or seeking opportunity, or both, my German family's tradition is that they had been in Germany for nearly 2 millennia. They'd come to Germany from Judea over 60 years after the temple was destroyed, and they came as slaves of the Roman 10th Legion. Yeah, those guys again. Because even 60 years after the Romans had sacked Judea, they were still fighting with those pesky, rebellious Jews. See, despite the destruction and the dispossession and the trauma, there was still enough fight left in Judea's Jews to make the Romans miserable. The face of this rebellion was an extreme and charismatic warrior named Shimon Bar Kokhba, who supposedly made his soldiers bite off a finger to prove their bravery. I guess he was from the Game of Thrones school of warfare. His forces were able to establish a short-lived Jewish kingdom, even minting their own silver with a triumphant slogan, "To the freedom of Jerusalem." But the rebellion only lasted a few years. The Roman Emperor Hadrian sent 1/3 of his army to crush the rebellion, and with it, any lingering dreams of Jewish independence.
The ripple effects of this revolt were, throughout the generations, but until today, what Hadrian basically did is try to sever the link between Jews and Jerusalem. He basically raised from the dead the name Palestine, which the Greeks referred to as like the Philistines.
By the time of the Romans, the Philistines no longer existed. There were no Philistines in Judea, which served Hadrian perfectly.
And he basically raised from the dead that term and just named the entire country the Provincia Syria Palestina. It's the subsection of the district of Syria. We're going to call it Palestine. No Judea, no Jews, and this is to sever that connection. So it strengthens a lot more where we are today, and we're still dealing with the ripple effect of Hadrian. Now, when he defeated Bar Kokhba and suppressed the revolt, he wanted to make sure that not a single Jew would dream of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem or rebelling. He needed to make an example. And one of the things he did is he went to Tirat Tzvi, and he made an Arch of Hadrian, and this is what remains of it. And we understand this to be the official archway to commemorate the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt. This was found in Tirat Tzvi.
You're telling me that the same line of my family that was, according to our tradition, taken by the 10th Legion, enslaved and brought to Europe, was the same line that came back to the same place where Hadrian had erected this sign to basically say, that's it. No more Jewish sovereignty, no more Jewish strength, no more Jewish army. In this very site, they rebuilt an autonomous Jewish community, one of the first in thousands of years.
In your face, Hadrian.
So we're going from the Bar Kokhba revolt to Germany, and then back to the very spot where Rome declared Jewish sovereignty in this land had ended. If you listen closely, you can hear my great-grandparents getting the last laugh. So that's part one of my dad's story, the German side. The other side is from Jerusalem. My paternal grandfather's family has been in Jerusalem for 7 generations. They lived in a community that would come to be known as the Old Yishuv, the retroactive term for the Jews living in Palestine before the political Zionism of the late 19th century. So I went to the Old Yishuv Museum in Jerusalem to learn more about the community my family lived in. The circumstances were pretty dire. Serious poverty, disease, very little access to clean water and food. And under Muslim rule, Jews were not even allowed to own property. The Jews were a mix of Arabic speakers returning from Iraq and other parts of the Middle East, Jews that fled the Spanish Inquisition and returned to the land already in the 1500s, Ashkenazi Jews who had been coming in small groups for hundreds of years from Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, and of course, those Jews from families that had never left the land. And they intermingled and created Jewish life in some of the most difficult circumstances.
I can't help, when I look at this footage, to think that my ancestors could be in any one of these shots. This was the period in which my ancestors were walking the streets, and so I look at these people in front of me and I feel incredible pride, but also a level of sadness to what they certainly experienced. My family, in this land, in this city, were second or even third-class citizens. They were dhimmi, ahl dhimma, meaning they didn't have the same rights as anybody that was an Arab Muslim.
Some of my ancestors came to the Old Yishuv in the early 1800s as part of a little-known Jewish sect called the Perushim. The Perushim were Lithuanian Jews, a community with a complicated and controversial history. Suffice to say, starting in the 14th century, Lithuania became a haven for Jews fleeing European persecution. The region would go on to become home to some of the most important Torah scholars, as well as some of the most horrible massacres of Jews. My dad's family that returned to Israel were known as Perushim, followers of a Lithuanian Jewish scholar so impressive, he became known as the genius of Vilnius. The Vilna Gaon, as he's called in Jewish circles, had dreamed of returning to the land of Israel, but was never able to. And so in the early 1800s, 500 of his disciples traveled by foot to Constantinople. From there, sailed to the Holy Land. They wanted to go to Jerusalem, but the Ottomans in charge weren't letting any more Jews from Europe into the city. The Old Yishuv's Ashkenazi community had fallen into terrible debt. When they couldn't pay up, the Ottomans kicked them out of Jerusalem and burned down their synagogue. So my ancestors went instead to one of Judaism's holiest and most mystical cities, Tzfat, a city defined by Torah study.
Tzfat is about not being distracted from what you're learning. You know, we are on a mountaintop. We're far away from other cities. at that time was very difficult to get here. Today it's still difficult to get here. Today there's still very few distractions. There are no movie theaters here, there are no shopping malls. We only got our first set of traffic lights a few years ago. So when you come to Tzfat, other than maybe this beautiful view, there's very little to distract you here. Your focus is uninterrupted Torah study.
My ancestors who came to Tzfat were following a long tradition of seekers and scholars. But less than 3 decades after my family arrived, the Jewish community was devastated by a series of tragedies.
In 1834, there's a pogrom that is initiated by the Druze community. Jews are killed, their houses are looted, their houses are destroyed, and many of the Jewish community die. Those that stick around after the pogrom are then confronted with the greatest earthquake that Israel faced in the last 1,000 years in 1837. When the town was completely devastated, there really wasn't much else where to go.
My family went to Jerusalem. This time, they were allowed in. When my family came to Jerusalem, they integrated into the diverse Jewish community there, which sometimes made for strange bedfellows, literally. Because according to my dad's family, one of those Lithuanian Jerusalemites married an Iraqi Jerusalemite, adding another branch to our family tree that heads straight to Baghdad. Now, to understand Iraqi Jews, you have to go back 2,600 years to 586 BCE. Yeah, that's a long way back in the family tree, but it's how my ancestors got to Iraq. See, the Jews were doing their thing in the capital in Jerusalem. And by doing their thing, I mean agriculture, trade, governing, and worshiping at their holy temple in Jerusalem.
These are clay seal impressions that were stamped by a ring. And here's a lot of seals and stamps of different types. This is a royal administration of the kings of Judah and Israel in the time of the first temple.
And the temple is the key word here, because the temple in Jerusalem wasn't just the center of Jewish life. It was also the symbol of that ancient Jewish belief that distinguished us from all other nations, our belief in one God.
One of the words that comes up a lot when we talk about the idea of temple and cultic worship is the idea of purity. And when we think of purity, we imagine, for example, purity of the body. There's a whole separate category of impurity, which is moral impurity. The Bible speaks of it as almost this invisible pollutant that spreads throughout the land. And actually what ethical monotheism introduced to the world was this idea that we were in a contract with that one God, but that God expected us equally to worship him through ritual and respect each other and build an ethical society. So the temple really is that microcosm. The temple represents this universal recognition of God and what God wants from humanity, the goodness that God demands of us, the, that sort of moral conscience that he expects of humanity.
And that's what the Jews were doing, or trying to do, for roughly 400 years in Jerusalem. But then the mighty Babylonian Empire came to town. 500 years before the Romans took a swing at Judea, the Babylonian Empire set the standard. They sacked the temple and destroyed the Jewish community, dragging its elites off to exile in Babylonia, aka Iraq. But the community kept their faith in the one true God and believed he would return them to Zion. And almost 50 years later, many returned and started to rebuild the temple, which, as you know, would eventually be destroyed by the Romans. But not everybody in Babylon went back. Some stayed, and their community grew into a major center of Jewish life. And it remained that way for thousands of years. That is, until the modern Iraqi government ended 2,600 years of tradition and scholarship with a snap of their fingers. Today, most Iraqi Jews live in Israel, the only place that would take them after the Iraqi government arbitrarily arrested and imprisoned them, outlawed the teaching of Hebrew and Jewish history, and stole their assets and property. And yet, they held on to their identity.
So the truth is, even today, if you ask an Iraqi Jew, who are you? They'll say, I'm Yehudi Bavli. I'm a Babylonian Jew.
It was in Iraq that we learned how to be a diasporic people. This was where we learned how to straddle the tragedy and the opportunity that came with being in semi-permanent exile. For most of our history, Jews have been outsiders. We've been expelled and ethnically cleansed, forced to seek refuge wherever we could. That means that we've been forced to cultivate resilience, to adapt, no matter where we are. After thousands of years in the diaspora, we've become mosaic. But even as we learned to reinvent ourselves and to adapt, even as we built up a thriving diaspora, we never forgot Zion. We longed for Jerusalem and the land of Israel, but we learned how to be Jewish when we were away from home. So where are we from? We've lived everywhere. My ancestors lived in Spain and Guyana and Germany and Lithuania and Iraq. But they clung to their minority identity, knit themselves tightly into their communities, and they took their culture everywhere they went. Over the centuries, it would have been a lot easier to just melt into the larger culture, to be like everybody else. It would have saved us a lot of grief, but we didn't. And that is what kept us rooted over all these centuries to this place. That's why every Jew can say, no matter where their family ended up, that here is where we're from.